All right, it is time for your piping hot monthly Bitcoin digest. Today we are going to be talking about the different supply and demand dynamics behind Bitcoin and the intersection of Bitcoin and AI. You are not going to want to miss a thing. Let's jump in. All right, so I typically do these to kick off a new month, but the timing with some of the other content I've been putting out is a little bit jumbled up. But in any case, we're doing a monthly digest today, and so we're going to be diving into a few key topics. Let's start with some of what's occurring. I think one of the bigger stories unfolding is this kind of anticipation around what's happening with supply and demand. So firstly, as many of you may have seen, we have seen this rather unprecedented movement in terms of Bitcoin on exchanges. And this view from Joe Burnett is showing Coinbase specifically, but if you were to plot kind of all the exchanges in combination, you would see very much the same trend. And that is around March 2020, again, specifically in this case, Coinbase held over 1 million in Bitcoin. That has dropped to less than half of that much, or the lowest Bitcoin on exchanges in over 5 years. And in this next view, we can see how that is wildly different from past cycles. You have seen pretty much a one-way train in terms of Bitcoin supply coming onto exchanges that grew pretty much nonstop from 2012 all the way up until March of 2020. And you can even see here by Satoshi Money BTC, the relative magnitudes, right? You're talking about in the 2015 cycle, an increase of 800,000 coins, 2018, an increase of nearly 1 million. And then for the latest cycle, we have seen a decrease of 1 million. So that's including the little over 500,000 we saw from Coinbase, plus that same dynamic that has been impacting other exchanges. So this is a huge deal, right? I mean, this is very different. This is not just a leveling off. This is a reversal of a trend that was in place for nearly a decade. And so the saying of hindsight is 2020, I think we've now got enough sort of distance between us and March 2020 to where we can truly say, okay, this was a huge phase shift for the adoption of Bitcoin. Individuals are behaving fundamentally differently than they have in the past. And I think that is in many ways a result of all the kind of fiscal response that we saw from governments around the world in response to the pandemic. And so it would seem a lot of people were jolted awake by that event. And with good reason, the amount of money that was printed in such a short span of time. If you thought the emperor had any remaining clothes, you were mistaken and were clearly shown the evidence of your mistake. So I think a lot of people have woken up and have realized like the emperor has no clothes. There is no solution. Governments are going to continue to print money anytime that there's an issue. And there is no way out from this sovereign debt crisis that is a global issue. And so you couple the fact that circulating Bitcoin supply on exchanges is going straight down with the fact that we are now less than a year away from the next halving, currently estimated for mid-April 2024, as we can see. So the new issuance of Bitcoin will be programmatically cut in half. That is an insane and indeed totally unprecedented combination of factors happening on the supply side. So I think that's a point worth highlighting, right? This we have not seen. And so anyone sort of parroting the point that, oh, well, of course, Bitcoin cycles, their returns are diminishing, right? Each subsequent cycle has a lower percentage return than the last in terms of its purchasing power increase relative to fiat. And all the critics who said, oh, Bitcoin, it's only being pumped up because of low interest rate regime. We've now seen the most aggressive hiking in basically 100 years, and Bitcoin's still holding up very, very well. Obviously far off its all-time high relative to US dollars, but it's already been hitting new all-time highs in a number of other fiats, such as the Argentine peso and others. So that's the supply side. Let's take a look at what's happening on the demand side. And it's interesting. Just when we thought all targets were really locked on, I did a video not too long ago, a couple months back, on Operation Choke Point 2.0, what appeared to be this very concerted effort by regulators in the US to discourage banks from serving, Bitcoin and crypto native companies, regulatory crackdowns from the SEC pursuing legal action against exchanges like Binance, Coinbase, etc. Just when everyone was like, oh man, here it comes, you then had, of course, the announcement from BlackRock that it had applied for a Bitcoin ETF. And of course, in the weeks that followed, everyone on Twitter, every influencer that's ever existed became suddenly an expert in ETFs. And BlackRock CEO Larry Fink has since said that, Bitcoin as an asset class has the potential to supersede, the fiat currencies of the world. You're sort of scratching your head like, what is going on here? And I think a healthy, skeptical, and adversarial mindset is always appropriate when a politically connected entity such as BlackRock enters the fray, but it is nonetheless a very interesting signpost. You also had Fidelity, Schwab, Citadel. These are traditional, powerful, politically connected entities back the new crypto exchange EDX. And in a truly shocking turn of events, you had a mainstream publication like Forbes publish not one, but two articles on the topic of Bitcoin and its impact on the environment that were either balanced or even positive. And so again, this to me is a pretty seismic narrative change. If you look at all the different publications that are suddenly coming out with somewhat more balanced or even positive pieces on Bitcoin, something is afoot. And I think there's a spectrum of possibilities. I suspect the most likely case is that these politically connected, influential, traditional financial institutions use their political connections to sort of clear the runway so that they could have a prominent seat at the table, because they probably missed out on this last cycle. They were just kind of caught by surprise, and they do not want that to happen again. It really is the old adage of, if you can't beat them, join them. Now, there could be more nefarious things happening. Maybe BlackRock gets this ETF out into the market and then funds the development of a fork of Bitcoin to put it on a proof of stake consensus method, and then makes the ETF track the new green Bitcoin, right? It's certainly possible, but keep in mind, as we can see, Bitcoin proof of stake actually exists, and the market was rather clear with what it thought about it. It has been a complete and total failure. So it remains to be seen, but it is nonetheless very interesting. And I'm telling you, regardless of what you think of this, it is setting the stage for a big narrative push that will just so happen to coincide with the halving that we just discussed. And this is happening globally, right? This is not just the US. You've seen large financial institutions elsewhere in the world like Banco Santander, who are putting out education, who are educating investors, who are even talking about things like the Lightning Network. I mean, it is pretty crazy. And there are also a whole slew of ongoing conversations at the nation state level, particularly for Central and South American countries. I think the market downturn very clearly paused or at least delayed some of those conversations. Another really interesting trend that we've now seen solidify for some time is this idea of shrimps. So shrimps are defined as on-chain addresses that hold less than 1 Bitcoin. They are currently absorbing over 100% of the new issuance of Bitcoin every day. So roughly 900 new Bitcoin come into existence every day. And when you add up even like some of these other bands, the crabs, the fish, you're absorbing far more than the new issuance every day. So small stackers are stacking their mines out, and as we saw earlier, are presumably taking self-custody. For folks that might be puzzled around like, well, Ian, why is the price not absolutely ripping if people are stacking way more than the new supply every day? Well, it is because there are other entities that are selling, and those entities right now are miners. And this is pretty zoomed in, to be fair, but if you zoom out, miners are currently selling Bitcoin at the fastest rate since 2019. And this is not a coincidence. This happens every cycle. Miners need liquidity in order to upgrade their machines to more efficient hashing units and more efficient ASICs, to prepare for the next halving. That is a humongous imperative for them if they are to remain competitive after the next halving cycle. So putting it all together, you've got this source of just constant stacking demand that far exceeds the daily new issuance, but that's currently being offset by selling pressure from miners. There's also rumors that the US government is selling some of its Bitcoin that it is confiscated from different things like Silk Road, etc. Of course, sellers will become exhausted as they always do. When that will happen and how remains to be seen. But the supply-demand setup is crazy. It is definitely the craziest I've ever seen. And of course, we saw presidential candidate RFK Jr. announce the intention to partially back the US dollar with a blend of Bitcoin, gold, precious metals, etc. And while folks have rightly critiqued this, oh, it's just political sloganing, oh, nothing's going to actually happen, or even if it did happen, there's no really such thing as like a partial backing. I think what was being proposed is even something as small as like 1% of new treasury issuance would be backed by, gold or Bitcoin or whatever. And it's like, well, that's not really backing per se. And despite those valid criticisms, I think the main point here is that it is even being uttered, right? It's even being mentioned. That is a totally wild notion that I don't think anyone would have believed even a year or two ago. So, could we see opportunities to stack sats at cheaper fiat exchange rates? I still think we could in the second half of this year as we edge closer to a recession. You still have a lot of macro issues, high interest rates, all this sort of stuff as a headwind. There is definitely an impending concern around liquidity crunch that comes when you have a downturn and you need to race to get dollars because all your debt is denominated in dollars and you need dollars to pay and service that debt, which when that happens, all assets tend to drop. So I still think we could see something like that in the second half of this year that could present some very attractive sat stacking opportunities. But I am also not holding my breath given the dynamics we just described. And so once again, good old dollar cost averaging is probably the answer. And we haven't even talked about a potentially massive new source of demand, and that is AI. All right, so AI is a pretty divisive topic. Some think, oh, we're imminently going to be exterminated by, artificial intelligence. Others think we're going to usher in the greatest prosperity mankind's ever seen. Others are just sort of watching with kind of intrigue and curiosity. And regardless of where you are on that spectrum, I think we can probably all acknowledge, if we're being truthful and honest, that it's happening. Like, it is a thing. Similar to Bitcoin, this is a genie that does not go back in the bottle. Recall that ChatGPT had over 100 million active users in 2 months. That is the fastest adopted technology that's ever existed in the human race. And so I think the key is, how do you enable access to these tools? How do you avoid a situation in which it's just you have a couple big centralized AIs being run in closed silos by governments or big corporations, big tech companies, that sort of thing? How do you avoid that world? And encouragingly, we're seeing a lot of open source competitors that suggests maybe we avoid that type of future. So with the assumption that this is happening whether we like it or not, I think that's the direction we want to see, is open models, lots of competition, AIs keeping other AIs in check. And also keep in mind, there is a very real resource constraint to running these large language models. And so, as Max Webster articulates in this excellent piece that I will link in the description down below, Max has written a lot of great stuff about Bitcoin, about Lightning Network, and now about AI, is he lays out a couple problems that need to be solved to ensure that this more open, accessible, let's call it kind of AI for all sort of paradigm is what we ultimately see. And so he goes through step by step how Bitcoin and the Lightning Network can solve for each of these problems. So number one, how do you train and serve these open models? Training these models is incredibly expensive. And so I think there is a valid concern that only governments or corporations with access to capital are going to have the wallet size to be able to even do this stuff. And interestingly, platforms with historically very open APIs, platforms like Twitter, platforms like Reddit, have started to really rein that in because they realize how valuable the data is that they're sitting on, and they want to monetize that for their own benefit. And so they've increasingly started to restrict API access, where all these different participants all over the place are trying to scrape this data in order to train these new models. So what Max argues here is that, well, the Lightning Network is perfect for enabling payment of contributions to these models. So in a way, you could have many, many different participants contributing to the building of these models, with payments for those contributions happening over the Lightning Network. Another problem is, how do you ensure you have quality data, right? The old adage, garbage in, garbage out, is very much true for these models. And so Max has a very interesting hypothesis around how Nostr might grow as this sort of decentralized communications network, and could be the perfect architecture to help fine-tune some of these models in a more open, decentralized way. And then the final problem is, how do you enable AI agents? These are autonomous AIs that can independently kind of plan and execute a particular task or action. How do you enable them to interact economically? Because these actions are not free, right? There's computational power, there's storage, there's bandwidth, there are real world costs. And so how do you enable these autonomous agents to pay for these resources? And Arthur Hayes writes yet another banger article on just this topic. He argues that AIs will unambiguously choose Bitcoin as the money of choice for paying each other and for paying humans, and humans to pay bots. He argues that AI fundamentally needs a blockchain-based digital payment system, given the sort of always-on nature of these AIs, right? Like, you have to have always on storage, so any of the traditional kind of payment rails are simply not going to suffice. He also makes this interesting argument that fundamentally the food for an AI, i.e. compute and data, is fundamentally a derivative of energy. And so the money that is going to be best suited for those tasks is going to be the money who best holds its purchasing power in energy terms. And Bitcoin, being a direct derivative of electricity, therefore makes it the best suited. It's also censorship resistant, and AI is not going to want to have to jump through these arbitrary human-made hoops and legal to be able to accomplish their tasks that they need to accomplish. So I would encourage you to take a look through those articles. And the exciting part is that this is no longer purely theoretical. Lightning Labs recently announced their L402 protocol, which is a standard for programmatically paying for content on the web using the existing HTTP 402 status code and using the internet's native currency, i.e. Bitcoin, over the Lightning Network. And so they've developed this sort of wrapper around the LangChain AI API. And so what this will allow for are agents that can hold a Bitcoin balance, send and receive Bitcoin. You could have agents being able to access payment metered APIs. You could have tools that would allow any API to become a pay-per-use gated resource, gated by sats. And I will link this in the description down below as well, but you can check out this demo from Cody Lowe, which is built on Chatbot UI, where humans could pay bots and vice versa, and eventually even machine-to-machine payments for Lightning. So that is bananas. And you also have this AI for All hackathon happening right now in collaboration with Replit. I mean, there's a whole host of tutorials on how you can get started with all this. You can get even voltage credits for Lightning infrastructure, for a Lightning node, if you want to participate. And so if you are a developer and have any interest in any of this, I would invite you to go ahead and check it out. I think the hackathon technically runs till the end of this month, July. But in any case, you're increasingly now seeing implementations. This is not just a theoretical, oh, Bitcoin is the perfect digitally native money for AI. And so I think this is a humongous deal. Obviously, it's a huge deal for Bitcoin, but I also importantly think that this can provide a helpful guardrail for AI, right? It keeps AI agents honest. You obviously can't print more Bitcoin out of thin air and funnel that into your all-encompassing centralized AI that's going to surveil and control all of us. Like, I think this is a good development. And so I would like to think that Bitcoin can be an ingredient to help us get to a world where there's a high degree of competition, lots of different open source competing AIs that are highly accessible to individuals. And so they become a tool for humans as opposed to our new overlords. Maybe that's optimistic, and there are certainly scenarios I could envision where the future scenario is much darker, but I remain an optimist on this topic. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments down below. But with all that, let's go ahead and conclude today's video. All right, so today we took a look at some of the latest and greatest around the Bitcoin supply profile. We talked about how shrimp are just devouring the new daily issuance of Bitcoin every single day. We did talk about the offsetting effect of how miners are selling in order to presumably raise liquidity, raise capital to upgrade their machines to the latest and greatest so that they can be competitive after the next halving that is rapidly coming up, slated for next April 2024. And then we talked about this new world of AI and Bitcoin. And as we discussed, I really think Bitcoin can be an ingredient to help temper what could otherwise be this sort of runaway, all-encompassing, centralized surveillance AI, this dystopian version of the future. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What do you think of any of these topics? Are there similar or related topics you'd like to see covered in future videos? Let me know in the comments down below. But I hope you found this valuable and insightful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like. Use the share feature underneath this video. That really does help get this to a broader audience. And if you're so enamored with this content, and you want to donate to support the channel and support a pleb, which really does help me continue to make this content, you can do so in a number of ways. You can use the super thanks feature built directly into YouTube. Although if you are going to donate, I would prefer sats. And so you can do that in a number of different ways. If you happen to be using the GetAlby Lightning browser extension, you can just click that and it'll automatically detect you're watching my channel, which is pretty nifty. You could send some sats that way, or I will have my Lightning address and Strike account on the final page momentarily. For now, we'll go ahead and leave things here. As a reminder, every sat counts. And until next time, I'll see you then.